Last Sunday's election in Hong Kong may have been strictly local, but it sent a signal straight to the heart of mainland China. In the face of an increasingly violent standoff between pro-democracy protesters and Hong Kong's Beijing-backed government, a record number of voters turned out for the poll and handed a landslide victory to pro-democracy candidates for the city's local district councils. The resounding defeat took Hong Kong's beleaguered government by surprise and upped the pressure on Beijing. Will that make a crackdown on the protesters more difficult or more likely? Hong Kong elections, wake-up call for Beijing? That's our topic. Welcome to the Point. We've invited three highly knowledgeable guests to exchange views on what the Hong Kong election result could mean. Hang-Shuen Lee, born in Hong Kong, works for 5 years at Deutsche Welle as a TV reporter and also on our China desk. And she says what happens in Hong Kong should be a wake-up call for the whole world. The Chinese regime is a danger to all free societies. Bernhard Bartsch is an Asian expert with Germany's renowned Bertelsmann Foundation, and he says Beijing's reaction to pressure is counterpressure. Not only Hong Kong will feel it, but also the West. And it's a pleasure to welcome Glacier Kwong. She is a Hong Kong native, a digital rights and political activist. She's currently studying in Hamburg, Germany. Her position: the opposition might have won the election, but not yet the fight for human rights. The system is broken. The fight can't stop here, and it can't stop now. So let me start out by asking the two of you, Hang-Shuen and also Glacier, what you are hearing from friends and family at home. What's their reaction to the election result?
They were very surprised because it was a landslide victory, and they didn't expect that. They expect the Democrats will gain a little more power, but not that much. So they were very happy, and they also expressed a lot of, they expressed their views online. For example, some of my friends said, well, many of the protesters are actually still under 18 and they still can't vote. And if they could have voted, then the results could have been it could have been a even bigger victory for the Democrats.
So that sounds like a pretty upbeat reaction. How about in the case of your friends and family, Glacier? What are they saying?
My friends are actually very surprised about the results as well, but they're a little bit more pessimistic. They were saying that, oh, now we have won the district council, so now what? What do we do up next? And would everybody just think because we have won the district council election, that means the movement is over? Many friends are kind of worried about that. People would have the a presumption that because we won the district council, then that's it for the movement. We have achieved everything we want, but it's actually not the case. So more or less, they're a bit pessimistic, but they're still very happy about, actually, at least we show the world most of the majority are in support of the pan-democratic parties.
Yeah, and you yourself clearly have an opinion. You say the protests can and should go on.
I'm not saying that the protests have to go on, definitely, but we have to continue to fight for our basic human rights. For example, the right to run for office, the right to vote for our leaders and our government. I think this is what I mean by the protest should go on. We cannot stop here because even though we won in this system, but the system itself is already problematic and broken. So we need to fix that before we can go any further in that.
So, Bernhard, it sounds to me, if I put that statement together with your own opening statement, that Beijing will sustain or even increase the pressure, as if we're not likely to see any real climb down from the stand down of the past months.
I'm afraid that's what's going to happen. I think this is actually much more than a wake-up call, because the alarm bells have been ringing for 6 months. So this is more the ice bucket that you get if you really, really don't get out of bed. The question is, does Beijing understand that the path that they've followed for the last 6 months just hasn't worked, and that they've totally underestimated the resolve of the Hong Kong people, and that they've kind of believed too much their own propaganda? Because, as far as I know, Beijing has been taken totally by surprise by this result.
Let's listen to what some of the protesters had to say after the election results to get a few more impressions about what people are saying in Hong Kong.
Some would believe that we have won the election, the people have won, but I don't think this is what we really wanted ultimately. What we wanted is the good laws to be enforced, and the law enforcers should be really doing the job rather than just standing on the opposite side of the people.
I think it's a start from everything, to be honest. Like, for the future, like for the protester, if it goes well and if the government replied it well, then I think the protests will just go down like peacefully. Otherwise, it's just gonna go up. Like, it all depends on how the government gonna reply.
District council election is already the de facto referendum to prove how Hong Kong people deserve free election, when more than 70 or almost 80% of people vote in an election. Why can't Hong Kong people get back the right to elect our government? We are not satisfied with only elect the district councillors.
So as we heard there, much is riding on what the Hong Kong government does next. Let's hear what the leader, the embattled Carrie Lam, had to say following the election.
We have officially and formally withdrawn the bill, which was a cause of all these social unrest. The next step to go forward is really, as you have put it, to engage the people. And we have started public dialogue with the community. But unfortunately, with the unstable environment and the chaotic situation, I could not do more of that sort of engagement. I hope that the environment will allow me to do it now.
Hang-Shuen, Carrie Lam and other members of the establishment in Hong Kong were as surprised as I guess your families were as well. Apparently, they had been expecting that the election would reveal widespread protest fatigue among ordinary citizens. Instead, it did reflect this widespread sympathy for the pro-democracy movement. Where does that leave Carrie Lam?
I think she's really embattled right now because it was, just like Glacier Kwong has said, it was like a referendum, and it clearly shows that Hong Kong people really want the protests to go on and that their demands should be met. And that leaves her in a very difficult position because, of course, she has to listen to Beijing as well because she can't just say, OK, let's meet the demands of people.
Glacier, would you have expected Carrie Lam to be more conciliatory than what we heard there? And do you think we may still see her make significant concessions? It wouldn't be the first time that she has backed down.
I don't think she would have the approval for Beijing to back down because backing down would make both the Hong Kong government and the Beijing government look kind of ridiculous on the global arena because China has always used strong-hand approach to deal with all dissidents in China or in Hong Kong before. So I don't expect to see Carrie Lam or the Beijing government to back down for a bit. I think they will approach a wait-and-see approach for the next week and see how does the peaceful assemblies is going on next week, and then they will decide. But I think if the government is not escalating again, or if they can stop the police from police brutality, then maybe there is a little room for a scale down of the protest. But I also think that the results actually show that most of the Hong Kongers feel that the use of force by the protesters is actually more or less legitimate, or at least can be justified, because I think the police and the government has already lost its legitimacy to rule and to protect its citizens' property or their life. Because in July, for example, in Yuen Long, the MTR station, when the trade members attacked innocent passerbys, the police were not there. And when pro-establishment supporters were attacking passerbys or those who were only doing peaceful protests or sticking up Lennon walls, the police were not there. And the system cannot hold the police responsible for their wrongdoings, and that's why Hong Kongers, peaceful protesters, and also the radical protesters are very hard to be divided because they see the need of use of force to make them feel safe, or at least feel like that.
Let's come back to the use of force in just a moment, because we do have a little report about that. But I'd first like to try to read the tea leaves in Beijing, if possible, Bernhard. So the Chinese government's initial response to this election result was quite muted. What do you think we can interpret from that? What will be going on right now in Beijing?
I think they're reorganizing because they were totally surprised and they didn't expect that this movement would really have such wide support from the Hong Kong public. And I think what they'll try to do now is get a feeling for, is there something where they can negotiate? A couple of years ago, when the umbrella movement was the big demonstration in Hong Kong, there were actually some offers from Beijing's side towards some changes to the electoral system. I don't think that's on the table again now, but I hope at least that they're reconsidering their position.
Please.
I don't think this would make Beijing feeling the pressure that they need to reform the electoral system. Actually, it would suggest the otherwise, because the government at Beijing now knows if it's a full democratic election, they will lose for sure. Even though from the general figures, we can see that the pro-democracy camp can only have 60% of support from Hong Kongers. But that's more than enough. That's already the majority. I think Beijing sees the danger of giving full democracy to Hong Kong because it means they will lose total control over Hong Kong. So I really don't think it would be the chance for Beijing to see, oh, maybe we should do a reform, because it wants to tighten its control over Hong Kong.
Yeah, I agree. And also, Beijing will not do that, because if Beijing is backing down, then it means that the protests we've seen, which has turned violent recently, that means that works. So it won't happen that Beijing will back down, I guess.
Let me ask you a little bit more about Carrie Lam's role, because Carrie Lam, of course, is the conduit for Beijing in Hong Kong. So on Monday, interestingly enough, leaders of the main pro-Beijing party were televised bowing collectively in a public apology. A pro-Beijing labor federation blamed Carrie Lam for their group's losses in the election. That sounds like she is deeply discredited on both sides, both vis-a-vis Hong Kong citizens, but also vis-a-vis Beijing itself. So what would you expect to be her fate going forward?
I think her fate to be going forward will be, it will be a very difficult situation for her, because you've already framed it very good. She's in a position where she doesn't get support from any parties, not from the pro-democracy side, not from the pro-establishment camp, and not from Beijing as well. Of course, Beijing says they will support her, but Carrie Lam has to listen to Beijing, and that's making her very difficult to stay in her role, actually.
So, question to you, Glacier, are there credible alternatives to Carrie Lam, bearing in mind that her term, as far as I know, only goes until 2022? Is that correct? And in fact, these district councils, they do not really have much say in larger politics, but there is a committee on which members are represented that will have a say in the next chief executive. So my question to you would be, are there credible alternatives to Carrie Lam who perhaps could find a middle path that she hasn't found?
I haven't seen any credible political figures in Hong Kong that would be able to resolve the political turmoil, because this political turmoil, not only this 6 months, but also those before, the smaller scales, for example, the umbrella revolution or the ones before. This is signaling there's something very wrong with the system fundamentally. There is something wrong with one country, two system even, because that was supposed to be a temporal solution to the problem of handing over to China. But this system, it's not a very stable and long-term solution for Hong Kong and China. So actually this signals there has to be something fundamental going on with the system itself to be able to resolve all the political turmoil that has been accumulating since maybe 2003. But I don't see any figures that are strong enough or powerful, capable enough to stand out and say, okay, let's do it that way. And I believe a fully democratic system is the only way out of this.
Any chance whatsoever that Beijing would ever agree to that? We're now talking about the difference between, in a sense, the short term that we've seen in the protests, that we've seen in these clashes, and the much longer term, namely the ultimate goal of China that Hong Kong would be fused into a larger China. Is there any chance at all that that ultimate goal for, I think it's 2047, would ever be adjusted?
I'm really sad to say I see no chance at all. I think there's no alternative to fighting for it, but in the current political climate in Beijing, this is not going to happen. The only hope that there is that there will be a phase after Xi Jinping, that the Hong Kong situation shows that there are many things wrong with Hong Kong, with China. they didn't see what was coming up in Hong Kong. There's so many other issues. It's not going very well for Xi Jinping and the Communist Party. The hope would be that they go back to a reform path and see that they are paying a high price for this. For the time being, Hong Kong is paying the price, but there's a much bigger price to pay, and that's coming home to roost for Beijing.
So that fight for human rights, let's come back now to the question of the protests and the violence. After increasingly violent confrontations between protesting students and police, Hong Kong actually has been pretty quiet this week, with the protesters holding off for now to see how the government responds. But they have left little doubt that they are ready to resume. Let's take a look.
The violent confrontations in Hong Kong hit a new extreme when police stormed university buildings, leading to numerous injuries on both sides. Right from the start, the Special Operations Brigades have been taking ever more drastic measures to get the protests under control, including tear gas. Meanwhile, the protesters' rage is boiling over, and the reluctance to strike back is evaporating. On top of the police brutality, the Hong Kong government's refusal to consider the demands of millions of citizens is especially frustrating to the demonstrators. And growing numbers of young activists are left with the impression that peaceful protest will achieve nothing. More and more are resorting to violence. But frustration can all too easily become blind, destructive rage. What kind of violence is justified in the struggle for democracy?
Glacier, let me pass that question right on to you. How much violence is justified under the circumstances?
I think it really depends on each context. If you're living in a fully functional democratic country, of course, violence is in no way justified. But in Hong Kong, the situation is a bit different. Like in June, 2 million people, nearly a quarter of the population, marched in the street peacefully. But then the government simply replied with "noted." And that's it. And it refuses to listen all along the way. We tried to make dialogues, but the government simply just ignored us. So I read a slogan on the Legislative Council on the news when people stormed into it. It says, "It's you who taught me that peaceful protest doesn't work." And I really feel how upset or frustrated protesters are. And I think because protesters and Hong Kongers now feels like that the police or the government are not able to protect them, as I have said. That's why they resort to the use of force. Nobody would like that, actually. It's actually very dangerous and it's very frustrating and tiring at the same time. I think most Hong Kong people would enjoy their life peacefully and quietly, but they feel like that the government has left them with no choice because they never listened. When we tried to go into the system in 2016, candidates got banned from running. And even this time in the district council election, Joshua Wong was banned from running for office in his district. And it actually shows that the system doesn't work. Even though you enter the system, you can be disqualified as legislators. And another thing is, I don't think Hong Kongers or the so-called violent protesters are attacking buildings or people randomly. They actually have specific targets and well-justified reasons behind that. For example, they go into MTR stations because before the MTR has allowed the police to go in and they have deterred first aid assistance and they have helped the police to cover up what is happening inside Prince Edward Station. So I feel like it's more or less justified to the use of force.
Let me ask Hang-Shuen if she also sees it that way. And in view of what Bernhard told us, that he doesn't see this regime in Beijing backing down from the long-term goal, which precludes democracy in Hong Kong. Are we basically seeing a generation of young people who may wind up giving their lives, or at least their future chances, to this fight?
They are already doing this because when they go onto the streets right now and protest, they risk getting arrested. And once they get arrested, they could be charged, and the terms can be they could be jailed up to 10 years. And they are already doing this. And I've also spoken to some protesters, very young protesters, and what they've been telling me is that they are willing to do this because they feel that they are young enough, and even if they get into jail for 10 years, when they come out, they are still young. And that's why they are doing this for people who are now over maybe 20-something, because they feel like they still have the youth to do this. And this is very sad to me, to listening to that they are trying to sacrifice themselves.
Yeah. Bernhard, ever since the protests began, there's been a lot of speculation about whether Beijing would eventually authorize a Tiananmen Square type crackdown. In other words, a violent repression of the protests. Now, surely this election result discredits Beijing as well as Carrie Lam. Does that make a crackdown more or less likely in the medium term?
I would hope it makes it less likely. I don't think it would work in Hong Kong because this is not like Tiananmen, a central square with a lot of people. The protests dissolve and evaporate. That's this water metaphor that Hong Kong protesters have used. I don't think nowadays with the technological means that Beijing has, you need a crackdown with tanks. I'm very pessimistic, though, about whether Beijing is going to give the protesters more room. I think they're slowly working their way through the ranks and putting pressure on them with every possible means. And I'm afraid in some ways this is going to work because they're making people's lives hell.
So how would you answer the question that was at the end of our report just now? How much violence is legitimate under such circumstances?
I don't think the violence has done the protest a great service. You know better how to negotiate with your own government. From a foreign perspective, this has really undermined the narrative and it has given a big propaganda present to Beijing because they could argue, look at this violence. I think the more subtle means, gathering in malls and singing glory to Hong Kong, is much more effective and much more subtle and makes it much more easier for foreign governments to support this, not only towards Hong Kong, but also in their communications with Beijing.
Let me ask precisely to the point of foreign governments what you think the outside world should be doing. Hang-Shuen said the election is a wake-up call to the whole world. What would you want to see other countries, other powers doing?
I think other countries should, seeing the case of Hong Kong or even in other parts of China, for example, in the western part of China, the Uyghurs, what they have been suffering, Uyghurs are the ethnic minority in China, and recently there have been leaks that proving that they are under the so-called ethnic genocide. Some people would describe it in this way.
They're essentially being held in concentration camps.
Yes, exactly. And so I think the case in Hong Kong and also in Xinjiang, for example, really shows that how Beijing is governing its cities or other places. And I think the whole world should now really look into this and say, no, that's not going to work this way. And if you want to defend human rights, that's the point right now. That's time right now to do this. And if you wait for another 5 or 10 years, who knows what China will grow into.
So, Glacier, the U.S. just has passed, in relation not only to Hong Kong, but also the Uyghurs, a Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act that would sanction officials responsible for human rights violations and also makes economic relations with Hong Kong conditional on the U.S. Secretary of State certifying that Hong Kong remains autonomous from China. Would you say that kind of pressure is helpful, and should there be more of it, for example, also from Europe, from Germany?
I think it's really helpful because right after the bill was passed in both of the parliaments and the U.S., the Chinese authorities were furious. 7 different organizations from the authority have spoken. It's like a combo. They keep saying that they regret the bill was passing, something like that. And I think if the European Union or Germany will at least propose some legislature or some policies like that, this kind of gesture showing that we are not going to tolerate Chinese violation of human rights would be very helpful in terms of the Hong Kong situation or those ethnic minorities in China, because it's a really good show of gesture saying that we are actually closely monitoring and we will take action if the situation worsens.
Bernhard, there's a lot of concern here in Germany, also in Europe in general, that the U.S. and China have become engaged in a standoff that almost resembles a new Cold War. And I often hear voices in Germany saying we have to find a middle way. In this case, does Hong Kong, do the Uyghurs show us that Germany needs to take a much stronger position?
I think it's right that we have to find some kind of middle way because we just don't, we're not the actor on the global stage that the US is. But I think everyone agrees that at the end we are on the Western side of things. If we are forced to take sides, then we stand with Western values. The question is, are we being forced? And issues like Hong Kong and Xinjiang do put this force on us, and that is good because it forces us to make big decisions.
Let me ask all of you very briefly, we're basically at the end of our time, wake-up call to Beijing. Will it be heard not only there but in other countries, yes or no?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, yes.
Okay, well, that's consensus. Thank you very much to all of you for being with us, and thanks to you out there for tuning in. See you soon.